Hello and welcome to another PSC webinar. I'm so excited to be here yet again. We have some very awesome panelists today, and it's a topic that I am personally just so excited to dive into. We're going to be talking about byproducts and co-products and what that all means for the pet industry. As people are trickling in, I wanted to put this in a little bit of context. We recently saw just last month this report from Nielsen that identified 10 growing trends within the pet food industry. And on that list was both zero waste and upcycled ingredients and also human grade ingredients. So hopefully today our panelists can help demystify kind of what that means for the pet industry and perhaps some of the trade-offs for environmental impact. So let's talk about what we're going to be doing for the next hour. As usual, I have some welcome and announcements, and then I will have some one-on-one conversations with our three speakers today. First will be Dr. Charles Starkey from NARA. Then we have Jan-Joris van Diepen from Mariu Nutrisciences and Blanc. And then finally, Greg Aldrich from Nulo. And so after I have my chance to ask them all of my questions about this topic, of course, we're going to open it up to audience Q&A. So please, if you hear something that you don't understand or you want to learn more about something, please go ahead and use the Q&A feature and we will explore that at the end. Before we dive in case you are new to PSC, welcome. We are a nonprofit and we're based out of Boulder, Colorado, but we work with companies worldwide and across the whole supply chain in the pet industry. And our whole purpose is to help the industry create more positive environmental and social impact. That obviously is not a mission that one company or one nonprofit can accomplish on its own. And so we do support companies one-on-one with projects and consulting to help them with their sustainability goals. But we also facilitate this industry-wide collaboration and try to bring people together to solve those issues together. We see this industry transformation happening in ingredients and packaging and responsible business choices. And we also see how those things all fit together. I also didn't introduce myself. My name is Allison Reeser. I am the Director of Sustainability and Innovation here at PSC, and I get the pleasure of hosting many of our webinars. So thank you all for being here. Speaking of our webinars, today's webinar is part of a series. We've had quite a few this year already. They're all available on our YouTube if you missed any and want to go back. So today, of course, we're going to be talking about co-products and byproducts in the pet industry. Our next one that we have on the calendar is Wednesday, October 22nd, and that's going to be about PSC's packaging pledge. And we do have some topics on deck. This morning, I think I confirmed that the sustainable banking one is going to be on November 4th. And then we're also working on a webinar with Greater Good about sustainable giving and disaster response. So stay tuned for more information about those. And finally, just some Zoom housekeeping. The Q&A button at the bottom of your screen is, I think, the most important one. Please, please, please submit your questions to us because we will have time at the end to address those with our speakers today. But also, if you want to interact in this virtual world that we are living in this webinar, please use the chat feature to just say hello or introduce yourself or say something interesting because the rest of the attendees will be able to see that. You can also use that react button. If you want to go ahead and find it now, we see that and it helps us know that you're out there. And if we see a heart or an applause, we know that you've appreciated what we just said. So moving on to our topic. Oh, I'm seeing the reactions. Great to see you all out there. So I thought it was important to start today's webinar with some definitions to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing. So as in the title, we're going to be talking about byproducts today, and this is officially defined by AAFCO as secondary products produced in addition to the principal product. So that just means that if something is produced primarily for muscle meat, the other parts of the animal would technically be considered byproducts. But there's also this term co-product, which doesn't have an official definition like byproduct, but the implication is just that perhaps there's a little bit more value to this material, which we'll get into later, but we maybe prefer co-product over byproduct just because of how it lands with people. Next up, human grade is another term that does have an official AFCO definition. If you want to read it, it's on the screen there. I think the key takeaway with human grade is that it's really more about where an ingredient is handled and processed, not necessarily the ingredient itself. Um, and this is a term that's really only relevant in the pet food industry because obviously all human food is human grade, and it is regulated by the USDA as far as those facilities that count. Upcycled is another one that's very relevant to our conversation because sometimes it gets confusing. Is something a byproduct? Is it upcycled? Is it not? I pulled the definition from the Upcycled Food Association here, which manages the certification for upcycled. And they define it as use of ingredients that would otherwise not have gone to human consumption and are produced with verifiable supply chains and have a positive impact on the environment. But it's important to note too that that is the definition for the upcycled certification. And really the spirit of upcycled is that we're preventing material ingredients from going to the landfill. And finally, one of our favorite words in the space is offal or viscera. And that is just those are terms for the edible internal organs of animals, excluding the muscle meat. Organ meat we would consider a subset of offal. If you have questions about any of these definitions, go ahead and drop them in the Q&A and we can clarify them at the end. Okay, so enough from me. I'm excited to invite our first speaker to join me on screen. So Dr. Charles Starkey is an expert, I would say, in the field of animal nutrition. And it sounds like from his bio, he's done a bit of everything. He got his PhD from Kansas State and has worked in business development and as a consultant, and even was a faculty member at Auburn University. Currently, he is the Vice President of Scientific and Regulatory Affairs for the North American Renderers Association, or sometimes we call it NARA. Are we allowed to use that shortening, Charles?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. The first question I have for you is just for people that are totally unfamiliar, can you describe what is rendering?
Yeah, it's dehydration of product mainly. There's about 70% moisture in your body or in an animal's body, and it's mainly dehydration. And kind of the best way to really look at it is when you fry bacon at home, you dehydrate that bacon, and then you get the fat that comes off of it. And that's basically what we do in rendering.
Okay. I love the bacon analogy. That's very relatable. So I do have some slides here that you shared with me, and I'm hoping that you can just walk us through the decision making, essentially. How is it decided that a specific part of an animal goes to animals or human food or rendering or not rendering? So I'll start with this on screen.
Yeah, so this is a description of how things work in the U.S. You can see there's a large percentage of each species that we choose not to consume. And to kind of go back to your question, the decision tree on what can go human grade or what can go into animal food or be rendered for animals, it really is an option of what's available and choice. There are some regulatory restrictions depending on the country or region you're in. But mostly it's a choice. So in the U.S., we really choose not to consume a lot of the viscera and many of the organs. And for example, our neighbors in the EU eat a lot of organ meat, kidneys and livers and things like that we choose not to consume here. So those products go into rendering or other processes to make protein meals and fats or flavors and other additives that are very nutritious for animal food. And this is just a description of what we use. We go by USDA edible parts, but for byproduct meals, we use viscera, heads, and paws are allowed from a regulatory perspective here in the US, and those make protein meals and fats. And so those can be utilized for livestock in the renewable fuel industry or for pet food as well. Blood products go, they make great fertilizer. It's really good for roses and tomatoes as well. I use some this summer in my garden. but they also go, it's a very high, very digestible protein. So young animals or high producing animals like dairy cattle will use that. Feather meal is also a highly digestible protein once it's been hydrolyzed. So it goes into lot of livestock feed and actually some pet food. And then, as I mentioned before, palatants are utilized. They typically come from organ meat, but can come from other sources of the animal. Fats are palatants. That's part of the reason we spray them on the outside of the kibble because it enhances consumption. And so those are all products that we make that are steered toward the livestock or the pet food industry. And very similar, we take a chicken, just like we call it a wog without giblets. It's what you find at the grocery store in the roasters that you buy and take home for dinner. And so we take those edible parts, and some of those go to animal edible use, bone residue and other things. We can make supplements out of them, gelatin and glucosamine and chondroitin. Those sometimes go for human uses and sometimes for animal. And then what we choose not to eat, even though like in other countries, sometimes they will consume viscera and utilize bones for cooking and livers and things. We choose not to eat that here. So most of that would go to produce that protein meal and that fat that we utilize for renewable fuels and livestock diets. And I just like to point out, overall, as far as the industry, we are the largest food loss prevention and food waste remediation industry. We do about 30 million tons a year. And through that process, since rendering's dehydration, we produce and treat and put back about 4 billion gallons of clean water back into the environment. So that's our entire goal in the rendering industry, is to provide safe, healthy, and nutritious food for animals and pets.
Okay. Actually, I kind of want to bop back to understanding rendering a little bit more. Can you just describe, so, okay, so there's a chicken liver. What happens if that chicken liver just gets no processing and like goes to a pet directly versus going through a rendering process?
Well, basically, rendering is mainly dehydration. We do get concerned, and we try to render at temperatures so we don't damage vitamins and nutrients, but mainly the difference is it goes to the animal with water. And so a lot of people in our industry and by request from pet food manufacturers and consumers, we may be taking some of those and not processing them through the render cookers, but putting them like using plate block freezers and things like that and utilizing it more that way and more of a fresh type use in the pet food. But at some point, that 70% water has to be removed. And so either that's done through the process of manufacturing the pet food or through the rendering process typically.
Gotcha. Okay. So it sounds like this decision tree, there's a lot that goes into it. It's kind of what can happen for the ingredient, when does it need to get dehydrated? There is some regulatory considerations, but then also a lot of cultural considerations as well. It's just like, what do people want? So it seems complicated.
It, it can be, and it's based on need and desire. Like I said, in the US, we choose not to eat a lot of organ meat. I'm not a big fan of livers myself, and so I don't go out and order those or purchase those very often. So because of those choices we're making, that product would go more to livestock or pet food diets or other uses. Whereas in other countries, most of the viscera, sausage casings are made from parts of the viscera, livers, hearts. We're seeing lungs in the pet food market now that are freeze dried, and so lots of products. They're high in vitamins and minerals and nutrients, and they need to go somewhere besides the landfill. So we find other uses for them, and typically that's livestock or pet foods.
Okay. Charles, my last question for you is really about the zero waste concept and full utilization, since that is really on people's minds lately. Are there new technologies or approaches that are helping the industry maximize that value and minimize the waste?
I we've always tried to, be really good at that. We take lots of things that don't go into the typical human diet and reprocess those into products that can be reutilized, whether it's fertilizer or animal feeds or renewable fuels. But I think the efficiencies are getting better. The equipment technology is getting better. We have some lower temp methodologies that don't damage nutrients such as vitamins and things like that. Uh, but our whole goal is to reuse everything and put it back into use. Part of the circular economy and keep utilizing that product. And in some cases, some of it's going to pets, but some of it's going to produce food for humans. And we export a lot of material that goes into aquaculture diets, and then the shrimp you may be eating when you go out to eat come from those farms and are raised and put back into circulation.
Okay, awesome. And yeah, we saw an AFIA report recently that shared that I think over 50% of the ingredients in the pet industry are upcycled or circular in some way. So like, there's definitely an opportunity for the pet industry to have a role in this circularity. Um,
Absolutely.
Charles, I know we could keep talking, but I'm actually going to invite our next speaker and we'll have you back for the Q&A. But thank you so much for sharing. So next up, I would like to introduce Jean-Joris Van Diepen. He has spent over 15 years as a sustainability consultant, and he's an expert in environmental footprints, which is what we're going to be asking him about today, and specifically for the agri-food industry. He's been with Meriu Nutriscience Blanc since 2018, and he leads the US team as the footprint director of North America. So welcome. I'm so excited to have you here.
Thank you, Alison.
Okay, so my first question for you is that we talk a lot about measuring the environmental impact of a lot of different things, but it can be confusing when we're talking about the environmental impact of different parts of one animal. So I'm hoping that you can explain the concept of allocation and how that applies to, for example, an animal like a cow. So if the steak and the lung come from the same animal, how do we think about those two different parts as far as their environmental impact?
Yes, thank you for the question, Alison. And when I think about the question, I think it's good to explain a bit how we do actually a life cycle assessment. So how do we calculate an environmental footprint to understand also this important issue of allocation? So what we do when we perform a life cycle assessment is we look at the entire value chain, the entire supply chain of the production system. And we look at all the activities and emissions that take place in this value chain. So if you're talking about animal products, that basically start with the feed production. So corn production, crop cultivation at a field, and all the inputs that you need to create those crops, like fertilizers and diesel that you consume on the land. So that's where we basically start our assessment. And then those corn products, they are processed maybe in ethanol plant. So you produce ethanol and you also produce what they call distillers grains, which is a feed product. So that goes to the feed industry. And then this goes into the animal, and in the end, this animal can deliver, for example, a dairy cow can deliver milk and meat. So allocation is about how you split these emissions of all those activities to the different products that come out of your production system. So I gave the example of corn processing to produce ethanol. You produce ethanol and you produce a distillers grain, which is a feed. So how do you divide all the emissions of the corn production and the corn processing to the ethanol and to the distillers grains? And again, when you are at the animal farm, yeah, you produce milk and you produce meat. So how do you allocate all these emissions, the environmental impact, to those different products that come out of your system? That's a big challenge in our life cycle assessments, and that's what we call allocation. And there are different ways to do that. And this is also always a discussion in the LCA community. Basically, if you look also at, let's say, the ISO standards, so the official standards to perform LCAs, it says you first have to look to see if there's an underlying physical mechanism behind this production process. So for example, if a cow is producing milk and meat, it uses energy to produce the milk and it uses energy to grow. So that could be a way to divide the impact, to look at the energy that the cow is using to produce the milk and the meat. But in many cases, this is not possible. So you are going to look for other causalities. And then you can think, for example, of economic revenue. So yeah, what is the, let's say, the total revenue of milk production, and what is the total revenue of meat production? And based on the economic revenue, you divide the impact. Yeah, and then also for the rendering, this is very relevant because we do also allocate, we need to allocate at the, let's say, at the slaughterhouse to the different products that come out of the slaughterhouse. So indeed, we have to allocate emissions to the meat, which go to the human food, and we have to allocate emissions to the co-products that can go to pet food or feed. So also there, this is really an important issue. And fortunately, there are some, let's say, LCA standards developed that guide you to make a choice there, and to make sure also that everybody is using the same allocation rules. So that's a bit how you try to divide yeah, emissions to different products that come out of your system.
Okay, so right, you could do it by economics, you could do it by mass, you could do it by the actual inputs for the different parts. Okay, thank you for walking us through that. I know that you have been doing a lot of research on this, so I'm hoping you can just walk us through some of the key, most exciting findings. And I know there's some slides to help you.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we did a study for the, let's say, the European rendering industry to create footprints of different rendered products for the entire industry. And this footprint data is distributed in a database which is from the global feed industry. It's called the GFLI, the Global Feed LCA Institute. So this is an industry initiative from the global feed industry to create standardized footprint data. So you can also compare results. Everybody is applying the same allocation rules when you are calculating your emissions. So this was the context of the project. So we collected all kinds of data from renderers in Europe to create this data, and we averaged that out for the entire European industry. So here I showed you some results of the carbon footprint results. We also looked at water consumption, very relevant, as Charles already mentioned, and other environmental impacts. I only show here the results of the carbon footprint. And you can also see in this data where the emissions are taking place. So is it indeed all back in the animal farm? Is it at the rendering facility? Is it at the slaughterhouse? So it gives you also insight in where those emissions take place. And you can see that for some render products, it can still, the most of the emissions really take place at the animal production states. And for other render projects, it might be that most of the emissions are in the rendering facility because of, for example, the heat that you are using to render. So this can really be quite some variety. But this kind of studies really gives you the insight in those kind of hotspots.
Okay, quick question. When I see food grade on this slide over to the left, is that talking about pet food grade, human food grade, or both?
This is human food grade. So because if we create such a model, we also have to model the human grade outputs. So basically, you get an overview of all the ingredients that come out of the system and the different impacts that come with it.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, and then I have this other slide, and it's again about because in the end you would like to compare different ingredients, right? As a pet food producer, you want to compare different ingredients and also compare different environmental impacts. And then again, it's really important that you use the same calculation rules, allocation. So this platform from the global feed industry, the GFLI, creates this standardized footprint data. And I just show here, let's say, again, the results of this European study, but it also shows some other ingredients that are used in the pet food industry with their environmental impact. So in this way, you can also compare, let's say, footprint of rendered products with, for example, some plant-based products. And you can also see there's quite some variation also in those plant-based ingredients. And I must say it sometimes also even depends on the source, so from which country you're sourcing. But this kind of platforms, as the Global Feed LCA Institute, gives this standardized footprint data method to make this kind of comparisons.
Okay. I guess so when you look at these charts, I guess so when I look at this, I say to myself, like, okay, it's really more complicated than just saying, like, what's the environmental impact of byproducts versus human grade versus something else? There's a lot more that goes into it. It's about the ingredient, where it came from, how it was processed. Is that the same as your conclusion, or do you have a different
No,
one?
no, definitely. And this is, of course, when a company starts with their footprint journey, you start with collecting your emission factors. So you just get numbers on your ingredients, and you try to give insights in the different emission factors of your products. And I think that's a really good starting point, because it gives you an idea of the impact of packaging and the idea of the impact of certain ingredients. But if you really want to work on the reduction strategy and make choices of different ingredients or sourcing, yeah, then you really have to dive into the supply chains and get standardized data to make these kind of comparisons and make informed decisions, basically.
Okay. My last question for you is just about the challenges. So allocation sounds like a bit of a challenge, but it seems like the industry has sort of aligned on economic allocation. What else makes it difficult to measure impact of byproducts across the industry? And do we need more standardization?
Yeah, so one really other relevant aspect of doing a life cycle assessment is data. We need a lot of data for this kind of research. And currently actually we're doing a project also with Charles to collect this kind of data with the American renderers to also create industry data for American rendered products. And there we really face challenges to get the right data. Maybe the companies don't report normally this kind of data, so you really have to explain them what kind of data we need. It's just in general a lot of data that we ask, because we ask data about sourcing, we ask data on your energy consumption, transportation. So it's really our data intensive projects, and that takes time. So yeah, that's something that yeah, there's definitely a way going forward, so people get just more used to collecting this kind of footprint data. But we are still in a phase that is very challenging process, and also what kind of data you need to collect. So
Yeah.
that's really a challenge, but also here standardization can help. So standardization can guide you in your allocation choice. And just I had one more visual here about this allocation aspect, because here I'm showing the impact of European blood meal based on different allocation types. And you can really see that which allocation type you choose, it really has an impact on the results.
Mm.
But so standards don't give only guidance on this, but also in the data that you need to collect, but also data that you can use from a database. So then you can, for certain data points, you can say, okay, I can use a database, but for other data points, it's really necessary that you get data from the supply chain directly.
Okay. I won't lie, this isn't the first time that I've heard that data is a challenge. And I'm really glad that there are people like you working on this. So thank you so much. We'll invite you back at the end for the Q&A.
Great, thank you.
All right, our final speaker is Dr. Greg Aldrich. I am so excited to have you here, Greg. He's the Chief Operating Officer at Nulo Pet Food, and he brings, honestly, a ton of experience to the table. Before Nulo, he was a professor at Kansas State University, where he ran their pet food program. And his research there focused specifically on how pet food processing affects dog and cat nutrition, which is exactly what we would like to talk to you about today. You're a true expert in the field, and I'm very excited to have you here. Welcome, Greg.
Thank you, Allison. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sure can.
Excellent. Good morning.
Good morning. Okay, my first question for you is just in your professional opinion, how do you feel about the humanization trend in pet food, and specifically the focus on human grade ingredients?
Well, let's start to unpack this by virtue of saying that humanization, by any other name, means that we're trying to communicate with our customers. The pet parent is the one making that purchasing decision, and anything that we're doing in the industry that helps them understand what the product is or motivates them to purchase that product is of value to all of us. And so calling it humanization really means that we're connecting with a pet parent. And so I don't have any issue with it. It actually fuels a lot of innovation. Nulo's a prime example. We're putting out a lot of new ideas into the marketplace. And again, we're trying to communicate and market those products to those consumers so that they understand. We have to realize that we are today in the US and elsewhere around the globe, we're anywhere from 1 to 2 and sometimes 3 generations off the farm. And so the understanding of animals and what their food requirements are is a foreign and novel thing to folks. And so anything we can do to help communicate, again, is going to help us out. So that's point number one. Your other question was about human grade. And you already provided some definition there in your opening remarks. And the idea here is that it communicates a wholesomeness that these pet parents are used to in their own food choices. And so they recognize that it is something akin to a USDA inspection. It's a regulatory term. They presume that there's safety aspects associated with it. But what most of them don't understand is there's safety aspects in with the passage of the Law for Food Safety Modernization Act that applies to pet foods as well. And so today, pet food is as safe or safer than human foods. So there really isn't a need for that moniker, but really what it tries to do is describe to the consumer that this is a product that they don't have to have mystery around and they can make a solid, informed choice. It's up to us to give them the rest of the information of whether or not a pet grade product is equal to or better in some cases than a human grade product.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about that, because we're talking about co-products and byproducts in today's webinar. So what is the value of those types of ingredients in a pet's diet, and do you have any concerns about their safety?
Well, the short answer is no, I don't have any concerns in regards to their safety because, again, we have food safety modernization. We have all sorts of rules and regulations and safety measures in place so that all of the raw materials going into pet foods and all of the pet foods being manufactured are going to be safe for consumption all the way through the supply chain. So safety really isn't the issue. Let me take you back a dozen or more years. We were doing a lot of research on the differences between things like chicken meal and chicken byproduct meal. And the only difference between those two ingredients was that the chicken byproduct meal, as it's defined in the AFCO official publication, potentially contains head, feet, and organs or viscera, the offals that you were describing. And if we measure the protein quality of those two ingredients side by side in a measure, something like a protein efficiency ratio, we'll see that the chicken byproduct meal, while it's considered byproduct and inferior by a lot of folks, is actually a higher quality ingredient because we've included those offals. The livers and the hearts and the spleens and the lungs have a very high biological value, both in their digestibility and in their composition of amino acids. And so it gets pretty technical pretty quick, but bottom line is the byproducts can be equal to or better in nutritional value. It really comes down to whether or not we can communicate that through to our consumers and get them to understand those things.
Yes. And that's actually something that I've heard in my work here is that people have this ick factor about byproducts, or they see something on the ingredient that they just like don't understand what that means. And they're like, maybe I shouldn't be feeding this to my pet. So I think that that's my last question for you today is just that how do brands deal with that negative connotation? And from a marketing and communications perspective, do you have any advice for brands?
Well, so for brands, one thing we have to understand, and I think most do, you can't be all things to all people and you can't get all of the consumers. And so as you stratify your message, there's various communities that we can address. And those addressable communities have their tolerances for what they consider in terms of nutrition and value and safety, et cetera. And so today, one of the fastest growing trends is raw, refrigerated, frozen, direct to consumer, delivered to your home. That's all great and wonderful. I like the idea from the innovation standpoint, but to circle this back to what Jen Joris was talking about, the life cycle analysis on those direct delivered to the home are very high in terms of greenhouse gases because we have a singular delivery to a home of a singular package. And so we like the idea, it communicates to that channel or that community, but each community is going to have their own a value that they're placing on the food. And we as brands need to understand who our community is and communicate that value to them.
Okay, amazing. Well, I think we should move over into our audience Q&A section of the conversation. I could keep talking about this. I learned a lot from you already, Greg, but let's open it up. So please, for the audience, if you have a question, please go ahead and type it in the chat. And Charles, there you are again, and Jen Joris, if you want to come back on screen. We do already have a question for you, Charles, in the chat here. So a question for Nara: have you ever measured the energy consumption difference between processing fresh viscera versus processing more degraded viscera, specifically during warm months? Do you see an impact of the degradation of raw materials in the energy consumption? It's very specific.
I have not personally. I think some industry allies are doing some of that, but we really get very little degradation, and part of that is the system of picking up. There's a lot of logistics involved in quickly taking that material to a rendering facility. A lot of rendering facilities are attached to the human food processing facility, so we make great attempts not to get that degradation. And so our operators would tell you that running that equipment, it is a bit of an art form, and there's continuous tweaking, throughout the day that goes on. So if they do have a little bit of difference in product as far as a higher fat that might, slide through a little quicker, they would adjust that equipment to meet whatever that input would be. So we don't really see a lot of that issue in operations, mainly because it's a continuous, constant monitoring. One thing we are seeing, and this kind of goes back to Greg's comments about knowing who your customers are, is we get requests, and so we've got people that are keeping materials refrigerated until they go through the rendering process, and that helps reduce degradation is not necessarily the best term, because that product's still pretty good, at least when we start to process it. So
Can I add to that, Allison?
Yeah.
So I'm going to shout out to the rendering industry. They have made tremendous improvements of their processes over the last 20, 30 years. There were times in the past, very distant past, where the non-integrated renderers might have products stored in a truck for 24 hours in the hot summer sun, and we would get auto degradation from enzymatic content of the spleen, et cetera, and it would turn into soup. It was much harder to process. Today, that does not happen. They've all learned to value those co-products because us as customers, the pet industry, are demanding that we get the best quality materials. So it's from slaughter to render as a very short period of time, and it's well controlled.
Okay. Greg, there's a question for you here. What is happening in manufacturing innovation with emergence of minimal processing techniques like cold pressed and rotary baking?
Yeah, so this is the fascinating area. So minimal or limited processing. We're seeing that in the human foods area as well. We're trying to get past these complex, over processed foods, and That's been a narrative even in Capitol Hill lately. And the idea is that we're trying to get to where we're not applying any more than necessary the amount of heat or conversion processes to take it from the raw material to the finished goods. And the idea is that we're going to retain more of the inherent nutrients. Of course, the challenge is always safety. So we have safety and shelf stability because we have to transport those materials. And wet materials, wet meat products degrade pretty rapidly. So we have to make sure we're accounting for that. So I know the market is growing rapidly. There's a lot of refrigeration and freezing involved in it. And minimal processing really is talking about taking the food product in whatever original form, applying just the minimum amount of heat so that we can stabilize it, whether that's shelf stable or whether it's just microbially stable, and provide it to the animal for final consumption. Again, let me reiterate, the intent is that we are going to limit vitamin and essential fatty acid degradation. We're going to convert the proteins just so that they're ever so slightly denatured, so that they're more bioavailable. And the starches are things that would have to be cooked extensively to make them more available. So the idea is getting that perfect mix to come up with a perfect pet food, and we're all striving to get to that end mark and communicate it to the consumer. The flip side of that is it is very expensive.
Okay, there's always a trade-off.
That's right.
Thank you. Jean-Joris, there's a question here for you. Can you elaborate on why economic allocation is better or more accurate than mass allocation for measuring the impact of different meat products? And actually, if I can add in a little to this question, we say a lot that the pet industry has an opportunity to complement the human food industry, which I think is somewhat related to the concept of allocation. So over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Alison. Yeah, like I said, allocation is one of the hotter topics in our business of life cycle assessment, and always a discussion. Um, first, I would say that the type of allocation that you choose depends also on the production system. So there is not one allocation is always the right one for any process. So you really have to see how the production system looks like, what are the drivers of this production system. But if you're talking about drivers, in the end, it's the economically that drives a lot of decisions, management decisions in a company. So that's a bit kind of the reasoning behind why we see economic allocation as the most valid for these type of allocation in the processing. So in general, for processing of food, economic allocation is the favorable choice, because all kinds of management decisions in a company are based on economics.
Yeah.
And that's the main driver.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay, there is a good question here about what is the biggest waste challenge you see in your process? So Charles, I'd like to start with you for this one. There's some details here about are there different challenges with upcycled or recycled or sustainable applications? Essentially, like, what's the hardest part about keeping these materials out of landfill?
I don't think it's hard. Greg kind of pointed to this in his answer earlier. Many years ago, we did not have logistics set up correctly to get product quickly to a facility that could process it. And then you had some scenarios where materials had to be disposed of. We have improved that. We've actually improved our processes. When you cook at home, you fill your house with odors, and we now capture all those so they don't get emitted. We treat wastewater. The largest rendering plant in the world is in central Alabama, and it treats water completely and goes right back into a river tributary there. So it's tested with the environmental department, and the water that's put in by that facility is cleaner than water upstream. So we strive to have zero waste in our process. And so we really capture everything and reprocess materials, even things that go with the water stream and nutrients there. Those are recaptured as well. So I don't think the modern rendering industry really has any waste of that product to speak of. And I know that the human food production industry on the animal side, they take great strides to capture every bit they can to go toward human food or to be reused for animal and pet foods.
Okay. Did either of you want to add to that question about just like where is there a risk that something does get sent to landfill potentially?
Well, anytime we get to something that's contaminated with metals or plastics or other extraneous goods, we have a risk that it's going to end up in a landfill. And so that goes further upstream into all of our recovery systems is let's keep it clean to start, and it'll be clean all the way through the system.
Okay. Greg, I'm coming back to you with a question about the current regulatory climate for innovation and the introduction of new byproducts or upcycled ingredients. Do you have anything to say about that?
It's evolving. It's probably the best way I can describe it. I think the state and the federal regulators are understanding that there's some pressure there to help communicate what the value and safety of products are, and so they're adjusting. We have a labeling modernization going on in pet food, and that should help with some of that communication. I don't know that they've necessarily embraced the idea that pet food, in my opinion, actually facilitates the human foods industry. We're helping them, helping the human food industry lower their cost by taking some of those co-product streams. And at some point, we've got to be able to value that and communicate it to our customers so that they understand that they're participating in this whole food chain in a positive way, rather than a lot of times we hear negative news about pets are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions and fouling of the environment. You know, one of the numbers that I'm looking at here is that on a global basis, the pet food industry contributes less than 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. We never talk about those kinds of things. And Dangeros has shown us a graph there, but if you look at those numbers, they're about yay big. When in essence, car transportation and other industrial processes are 100-fold more. And so I think we can be proud about where we are in the pet space, and we need our regulators and our innovation to be recognized and advanced in the same way.
Okay.
We're an unheard minority in this whole industry.
Yeah. Jen Joris, I kind of saw you nodding. Did you want to respond to that as well?
No, there was just more and more thought that came up. It's not really related to innovative byproducts, but of course there's a lot of innovative new novel ingredients that are used in pet food, and of course there we also look at environmental impact. And yeah, also there it's again there is no right answer. It's always good to have a good look at your value chain, also on those new ingredients, to make fair comparisons there.
Yeah. Okay. Charles, I think you were also sort of nodding about regulations. Was there a certain regulation that is top of mind for you?
No, you know, Greg brought up the Food Safety Modernization Act, and our ingredients are considered a food is considered a single ingredient or the mixture of them. So everything really gets treated the same. And from a environmental regulation policy, those are developing in countries, and we aren't real certain, with the exception of EU, who wrote a bunch of new regs out last year. That's yet to be seen, but really our scoring typically, and Jan Joers showed for a lot of co-products, the scores are quite low. And so to Greg's point, we really don't, as an industry, have a tremendous impact on those numbers, and you know, everybody is working and actually staying ahead of regulations to minimize emissions and things like that. So I just in complete agreement with both of them.
Okay. Yeah, it's really interesting when we start comparing industries and what are the emissions from this versus that. And I think that there is definitely reason to celebrate like the co-products that we are able to use, and we have great uses for pets so you don't end up in landfills. But then at the same time, of course, there is still work to be done in the pet industry to continue optimizing and minimizing and making a positive impact rather than a less bad impact.
So Allison, can I jump in and add something to that?
Yeah,
You
yeah.
asked, I think it was Charles or Jan Joris, and maybe it was Charles, what the biggest risk factor out there in terms of this area of sustainability, and that's really kind of the topic here. And it is a byproduct of our industry, and that is packaging. And we're spending a huge amount on packaging across the industry. And I'm going to throw down the challenge. We're working on it in our side, and that is being able to reuse or decrease our footprint from packaging. That's probably a third of what's going in regards to cost associated with greenhouse gases. It doesn't affect Charles and the renderers, but the rest of us on the finished product side and communication with customers, packaging is a challenge. It's an expense that we just throw away. It goes into landfill. It's absolutely vital that we do it right and we capture the information and we communicate. But at the end of the day, it's trash and we've got to do something about it.
Yes, absolutely. Packaging is such an important piece of the puzzle because consumers also really care about it. I also wanted to make a quick connection too. So I know that flexible plastic packaging is typically not recyclable because there is no profitable end market for the recycling of that material. So there's no company out there that's excited to take it and deal with it. And I actually was thinking that for co-products and byproducts, it's not the same, that it's like there are these materials and there is this end market that is valuable, potentially a little bit less of an economic benefit to like the primary reason that a certain animal was grown. But I'm just like happy that our problems are different on the ingredient side as the packaging side. But that just opened a whole can of worms.
Sorry about that, but it's one of those things that I think the two biggest costs that we have in delivering pet food to consumers is the transportation and the packaging.
Yeah.
And all of the co-product, byproduct, and all of the other raw materials, offals, they take up a lot of our conversation, and it's valuable. Don't get me wrong. It's an area that I've invested a lot of my career into. But having been on this other side, on the commercial piece of the equation today, I see that that's one of the areas that we've got the greatest amount of work to do.
Yeah. Okay, well, I'm always happy to open up a can of worms, but I also want to make sure that we end on time. So we have gotten to all of the questions that were submitted in our Q&A. So we can go ahead and conclude, but if anyone here today has more questions, feel free to contact PSC and we will direct you to the answer. So I'd like to end by giving each of you just about a minute or less to leave the audience with your closing thoughts. And I'd actually like to come back to the title of the webinar. So if you can wrap up by saying, how do you wish the pet industry was optimizing co-products and byproducts? Greg, let's start with you, and then we'll go Jen, Joris, and Charles.
So the industry is doing an exceptional job today of optimizing co-products and byproducts. And what we've got to do is an even better job of communicating with our consumers, our customers, our pet parents, as to what that value means to both their food supply chain, their pets' nutrition, and health and well-being.
Great. Thank you. Jen, Joris?
Yeah, no, I think we have seen that with byproducts, you could potentially lower the footprint of your pet food product. So I would say if you're not yet doing environmental footprint assessment, start with collecting emission factor of your ingredients. When you really want to work on a reduction strategy, make sure you make the right comparisons, and you can, it could be a way of your strategy, your greenhouse gas reduction strategy, to include also animal byproducts in your pet foods.
Thank you. And Charles?
There's not a lot left to say. I'm going to give iFeeder a shout out. We partnered with them and Pet Food Institute, and if you go to ifeeder.org, there's a livestock report and a pet food report. And to be honest, the pet food industry is doing outstanding. The only industry that's beating them on use of co-products would be the aquaculture industry. Dairy's close at about that 50%, but both cat and dog food are already achieving that 50%. And so through new technologies and partnering with pet food companies, if we can increase that inclusion of all circular ingredients and co-products, I think it'll just continue to improve. So they've recognized it and they're doing a great job.
Awesome. I will give myself the same opportunity. My main closing thought is just gratefulness and gratitude for the three panelists today. Thank you so much for being here. And also I'm thankful to the attendees here that are giving us a lot of applause with the reaction. So thank you. But then as far as our topic, I think some of my takeaways are byproducts are not gross. They're safe and they're regulated and they should be in pet food. And that also there is not this black and white spectrum of like human grade premium ingredients are over here and then byproducts are nasty and they're over here. Like that is just so wrong. And there is a lot of different trade-offs and a lot of different great options, and that it needs to just be communicated to the customer. So thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Allison.
Great opportunity.
All right. Bye, everybody.